And by the time he was a young man, Reagan was aware of an international movement that ran in direct, violent opposition to everything he stood for, the atheistic strain of communism that precipitated the Russian Revolution of 1917. Reagan's life and political career coincided almost exactly with the rise and fall of communism in Russia. He was born on February 6, 1911, in Tampico, Illinois. When the Bolsheviks launched their bloody coup in St. Petersburg in October 1917, he was an innocent 6-year-old. Only days after that revolutionary fire broke out in Russia, with Vladimir Lenin emerging from the flames, the Universalist Church in Dixon, Illinois, burned to the ground. 5 years later, the first Christian church emerged from the ashes on that same spot. That sanctuary at 123 South Hennepin Avenue would shape young Ronald Reagan as surely as the coals of the Russian Revolution forged Lenin. As Lenin was nearing death in the first month of 1924, Reagan was approaching his teen years. When Joseph Stalin at last seized absolute power, Reagan was heading to the friendly confines of Eureka College. As Stalin murdered tens of millions, Reagan was looking for a job. As the Soviet communists pursued the expansion of Marxism-Leninism and their brutal campaign against religion, the mature Reagan watched with pity, disgust, and a commitment not to be silent. By the time he became president in January 1981, he was not only ready to take action against Lenin's empire, he was committed to doing so by every means necessary. Only in that moment, perhaps, does it become clear how deep and how atypical the man's faith actually was. When faced with what he saw as a dark force of history, Soviet communism, Reagan met it with not only his political but his spiritual beliefs. The Cold War is recognized by historians as the great ideological struggle of the 20th century. But to many, including those jailed in the USSR for religious reasons, it also represented the great struggle for faith in the 20th century. Reagan shared that view. Thus, this spiritual biography, like Reagan's own pilgrimage, will culminate in President Reagan's personal crusade, a word both he and Soviet commentators used to describe his actions, to undermine Soviet communism. That is the journey explored by this book. We'll trace Reagan's journey from the baptismal tank of the First Christian Church on South Hennepin in Dixon in 1922 to the podium at a tents-packed Moscow State University in 1988. And we'll examine Reagan's vision of America as both a divinely ordained beacon of freedom, a shining city upon a hill, and a nation chosen, in his view, to place a stake in the future of communism. While Reagan's religious belief system was distinctively Christian, the goal of this exploration is not to prove his faith, to debate whether he was a good Christian, or to assess the sophistication of his religious views. Nor is the goal to categorize his theology or where he best fit denominationally. My concern is with Reagan's spiritual beliefs, how they mattered, and how they strongly affected his thinking and actions. Most important, my intention is to underscore that it's impossible to understand Ronald Reagan fully, and especially his Cold War actions, without grasping the influence of religion on his thought. Alzheimer's disease felled Reagan only a few short years after the USSR fell onto that ash heap of history he foresaw. Mercifully, his mind lasted long enough to recognize what had happened. Soviet communism had met an end he had pursued for more than 40 years. In part, as he himself said, his campaign was motivated by his belief that as a Christian he was enjoined by Scripture to resist and attack evil wherever it lurks. As he told a joint session of the Irish National Parliament on June 4, 1984, he believed the struggle between freedom and totalitarianism today was ultimately not a test of arms or missiles, but a test of faith and spirit. It was, he said, a spiritual struggle. This, then, is not simply a story of an influential man in a powerful position who came to believe that God had chosen him for a special purpose. Reagan's religious faith was a critical factor in one of the most important events of the 20th century. It had an immense impact on his thinking and action toward Soviet communism and the Cold War. As the Soviets themselves recognized in a formal statement from TASS, the official Soviet news agency, President Reagan uses religion with particular zeal to back his anti-Soviet policy. Obviously, it would be